He laughed and said, "You think I'd give up everything for you?" 6 years later, he saw her again, with 2 boys who looked exactly like him. The sound of the city at night was always the same for Michael Reed, quiet but restless, full of movement and ambition hidden beneath the surface. From his office window on the top floor of Reed Enterprises, he could see everything: the glowing skyline, the river cutting through the dark, the streets that never seemed to sleep. He had built this world himself, piece by piece, through sheer will and discipline. Every decision had been calculated, every risk controlled. There was no room for chaos, no room for weakness, and certainly no room for love. That was why, 6 years ago, when Emma stood in this very office with tears in her blue eyes, he chose his empire over her. "You think I'd give up everything for you," he had said with a cold laugh, the words slipping out like a blade. He hadn't meant to hurt her, he had meant to remind himself that he didn't need her. But as soon as the door closed behind her, silence filled the room like a wound. Back then, Emma had been the only person who ever made him feel something human. She wasn't impressed by his money or the way people treated him like a god in a tailored suit. She saw the man underneath, the one who had grown up in a small, broken home, desperate to prove that he would never be powerless again. She loved him for reasons he couldn't understand, and that terrified him. When she told him she was pregnant, his first instinct wasn't joy, it was fear. Fear of losing control, fear of vulnerability, fear of being tied to something real. He told himself it was impossible, that she was lying or mistaken. But deep down, he knew the truth. He just couldn't face it. After that night, he buried himself in work as if the noise of success could drown out the echo of her voice. He expanded his company, doubled his wealth, and filled his days with meetings, conferences, and meaningless affairs that never lasted more than a few weeks. He told himself he was happy, that he had chosen correctly, but every now and then, something would break through his carefully constructed armor: a laugh from a stranger that reminded him of her, the sound of a child's voice in a crowd, the faint scent of jasmine that brought back memories he didn't want. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Emma was learning to survive. She moved to a quiet town near the coast, where the air smelled of rain and sea salt. She gave birth to 2 boys, Liam and Noah, 2 small miracles who looked at her with the same eyes that once made her fall in love. She raised them alone, working long shifts in a small cafe by day and drawing late into the night when the boys were asleep. Sometimes she would stop and just watch them breathe, her heart full and aching at once. There were moments when she wanted to call him, to tell him that their sons were beautiful and perfect, but then she would remember his voice, cold and distant, and remind herself that she didn't need him anymore. For Michael, success only made the emptiness worse. Every award, every headline, every new contract signed brought less satisfaction than the one before. His office, once his fortress, began to feel like a cage. Late at night, when the city outside was asleep, he would sit in silence, wondering what it would have been like if he had chosen differently. He had everything a man could want, yet there was a hollow space in his chest that nothing seemed to fill. His assistants came and went, his relationships ended before they began, and every morning he woke up feeling the same, tired, disconnected, and unsure why the life he built felt so meaningless. 6 years had passed, and though he had everything, he realized he had no one. There were rumors about him in business circles, about how ruthless he had become, how emotionless. People admired him, feared him, envied him, but no one really knew him. He had built walls so high that even he couldn't see over them anymore. Sometimes, when he looked at his reflection, he didn't recognize the man staring back. The dark hair neatly combed, the expensive suit, the sharp brown eyes, all of it looked powerful, but beneath that surface, he was just tired. One night, as he sat in his office long after everyone had gone home, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and leaned back in his chair. The city lights reflected off the glass, creating flickers of gold that reminded him of her hair. Without realizing it, he whispered her name. The sound felt foreign on his tongue, like something from another life. He stood abruptly, angry at himself for even thinking of her. But the truth was, he never stopped. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that if he ever saw her again, if he ever saw the child she claimed was his, he wouldn't be able to walk away a second time. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass walls of his office. He closed his eyes and imagined what her life might look like now. Did she ever think of him? Did the child have his eyes? He told himself it didn't matter, that it was too late, but the ache in his chest said otherwise. For the first time in years, Michael Reed, the man who had everything, felt completely powerless. He didn't know it yet, but life had a way of forcing even the proudest men to face what they had tried to escape. And soon, fate would bring him face to face with the very thing he had spent 6 years running from, the truth. The morning light spilled across the park, soft and gold, touching every leaf and blade of grass as if the world itself had been painted new. Michael Reed wasn't supposed to be there. He never went to places like this, too casual, too full of noise and life he didn't understand anymore. But that Sunday morning, at the persistent invitation of a business associate, he found himself walking along a narrow path lined with trees. He was half listening to the sound of children laughing somewhere nearby when some instinct buried deep in his chest, made him stop. His eyes searched the open field until they found her. Emma. She was sitting on the grass under a tree, her hair brighter in the sunlight than he remembered, her head slightly tilted as she watched 2 boys tossing a ball back and forth. The boys looked identical, their laughter filling the air, their faces bright with that wild, carefree joy only children possess. And then, as one of them turned toward him, Michael felt the air leave his lungs. The boy's eyes, brown and sharp, deep and familiar, were his own. He stood frozen, unable to move, as if the ground itself had turned to glass beneath him. He hadn't seen her in 6 years, hadn't dared to look for her, and yet here she was, unchanged and yet completely different. She looked older, yes, but stronger too, as if the years had carved both grace and resilience into her. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment, he almost turned around and walked away. But something stronger than pride held him there. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. Time stopped. For a heartbeat, there was nothing else, no people, no noise, no distance. Just 6 years of silence breaking all at once in the space between them. Her face changed in an instant, surprise, disbelief, then a stillness that cut him deeper than anger ever could. Michael walked toward her slowly, each step heavier than the last. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She didn't stand up. She simply looked at him with that same calm, steady gaze that once made him feel completely exposed. When he finally stopped in front of her, she said quietly, "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was low, even, but he heard the tremor underneath it. "Emma," he began, his throat dry, "I didn't know." She interrupted before he could finish. "You didn't want to know." It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The boys were watching him curiously now, their ball rolling forgotten in the grass. One of them tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "Mom, who's that?" The word hit him harder than any blow could have. Mom. Not Emma, not her, but Mom. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and said softly, "No one you need to worry about." The dismissal was gentle, but it gutted him. He had never imagined himself as a father, not really, but standing there, looking at those 2 boys, something inside him cracked wide open. He saw himself in them, not just in their faces, but in their gestures, the way they stood, even the way they tilted their heads when curious. He wanted to say something, anything, to make her understand how wrong he'd been, but the moment was already gone. He left the park that day without another word, his mind a storm. The image of her, of them, burned itself into his thoughts. He drove home in silence, every mile feeling like punishment. In his penthouse that evening, surrounded by glass and steel, he couldn't escape the sound of their laughter echoing in his memory. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt empty. He poured himself a drink, but the whiskey didn't burn the way it used to. He set it down untouched. He went to the window and stared out at the city, at the empire he had chosen over her, and for the first time, he asked himself if any of it had been worth it. That night, sleep didn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. The curve of Emma's smile as she looked at the boys. The way one of them had brushed his hair from his forehead, a gesture so familiar it hurt. He thought of the day she had told him she was pregnant, the disbelief, the anger, the cruel laughter that followed. He had wanted to protect himself back then, to keep control. Now he realized he had been protecting nothing but his own emptiness. By morning, his decision was made, though he didn't yet understand what it meant. He had spent 6 years running from the consequences of one mistake, and somehow, fate had brought them back to him. He couldn't change what he'd done, but he could no longer pretend those boys didn't exist. He didn't know how to approach her again or what he could possibly say that would make a difference. But one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away a second time. He had built his life on choices that made him untouchable, invincible even, but standing there in that park, seeing his reflection in the eyes of 2 children, he realized that some mistakes couldn't be buried beneath success. Some things, some people, were worth everything he once thought he couldn't risk. For the next few days, Michael couldn't think of anything else. Every meeting blurred together, every phone call sounded distant, every face around him felt meaningless compared to the ones he had seen in the park. He tried to bury himself in work like he always did when something unsettled him, but the strategy failed for the first time in his life. He had built a fortress around himself out of deadlines, numbers, and control, but now that fortress felt small and suffocating. The memory of the boys' laughter wouldn't leave him. He could still see the way Emma had looked at him, steady, calm, untouchable, and that haunted him more than her anger ever could have. He realized that she didn't hate him anymore. She simply didn't need him, and that realization shook him to the core. For a man who had built his identity on being irreplaceable, the idea that she and those boys had lived without him, thrived without him, was almost unbearable. By the 3rd day, he couldn't take it anymore. He drove back to that park, convincing himself he was only going for closure, only to prove that what he had seen hadn't been real. But when he saw them again, all his rationalizations collapsed. Emma was sitting at a picnic table this time, sketching something in a notebook, her hair falling over her shoulders. The boys were playing nearby, chasing each other through the grass. They were wearing mismatched clothes, one with a blue jacket, the other with a green one, but they moved in perfect rhythm, like 2 parts of one soul. He watched from a distance, not wanting to frighten them, but unable to leave. Every now and then, one of them would laugh and call out, "Mom, look," and Emma would smile and wave, her expression soft in a way he hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. It struck him that he had never seen her like this before, not in the penthouse, not in the city, not when they were together. She had always been trying to fit into his world, to be enough for him. Here, she was just herself, and it was beautiful. He finally gathered the courage to approach. His shoes crunched softly on the gravel as he neared the table. Emma didn't look up at first, but when she did, her hand froze mid-sketch. The air seemed to grow heavier. "Michael," she said quietly, more as a statement than a greeting. "I told you not to come back." He swallowed, searching for the right words but finding none that seemed worthy. "I just wanted to see you," he managed, his voice low. "To see them." She set down her pencil and closed her notebook slowly, her movements precise and deliberate, like she was trying to maintain control over every breath. "You've seen us. Now you can leave." He shook his head, frustration rising in his chest. "I can't," he said. "Emma, she cut him off, her tone sharp but not cruel. "Don't. Don't come here pretending this is about them. You're not here because of them, Michael. You're here because you're guilty. The words hit him like a physical blow because they were true. He stood there in silence, feeling the weight of 6 years pressing down on him. Maybe I am, he admitted finally, his voice rough. But I can't change the fact that they're mine. Her eyes flashed for the first time, anger flickering through the calm. Yours, she repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. You forfeited the right to call them that the day you walked away from me. The boys had noticed the tension now, their laughter fading as they watched from a distance. Michael took a step back, his throat tight. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said quietly. I just want to know them. Please. For a long moment, she didn't answer. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and she brushed it away mechanically, avoiding his eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer but full of exhaustion. You don't just walk back into someone's life after 6 years and expect it to mean nothing. You can't fix what you broke with words, Michael. You don't get to come here and rewrite the story just because you finally feel something. Her words burned, but he didn't move. Then tell me what I can do, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Tell me how to start. She looked at him then, and for a moment, he thought he saw something shift in her expression, pain, maybe, or pity, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. You start, she said, by not making promises you can't keep. He left the park that day feeling hollow. Every word she said replayed in his head like a loop, and for the first time in years, he couldn't find comfort in control or logic. He couldn't file this away as a problem to be solved or a deal to be negotiated. He had faced business rivals, political battles, even public scandals, but nothing had ever made him feel so powerless. He had lost her once out of arrogance, now he feared he might lose her again because she no longer cared. Still, as he drove away, he made himself a silent vow. He wouldn't disappear this time. Even if she never forgave him, even if the boys never called him their father, he would stay close. He would find a way to prove that he wasn't the same man who once laughed in her face and walked away. That night, long after midnight, he sat in his apartment staring at an old photo of her he had kept hidden for years, a small, candid picture of her laughing in the kitchen one morning, sunlight catching her hair. He traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb and whispered, "I'm sorry," though no one was there to hear it. For the first time in his life, Michael Reed realized that some mistakes couldn't be erased by power or money. They could only be lived through, one small act at a time, until forgiveness, if it ever came, was earned. The following weeks unfolded in slow, restless waves. Michael found himself returning to the park almost every weekend, telling himself he was just passing by, though deep down he knew that was a lie. He began to learn the rhythms of Emma's new life, not through intrusion but through quiet observation. She came to the park on Sundays, always around the same time, with a picnic blanket and a small basket of snacks. The boys would run ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees, while she followed with her sketchbook and that same old thermos she used to carry years ago. There was something healing and painful about watching her like this. He had once been part of her world, and now he was only a distant observer standing on the edges of what might have been his life. The more he saw, the more he understood how completely he had been erased, not out of cruelty but necessity. She had built stability where he had left chaos, warmth where he had given her coldness. One afternoon, he couldn't resist approaching again. This time, the boys were closer, chasing each other around the bench where she sat. He noticed how she smiled at them, the same smile she used to give him when she still believed in him. He walked toward her slowly, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat as if to stop them from shaking. She looked up before he even spoke, her eyes narrowing slightly but without the shock she had shown before. "You don't give up easily," she said quietly. Her tone wasn't mocking, just tired, as though she had accepted that he would keep coming back no matter how much she tried to push him away. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the far end of the bench. "I just want to talk," he said. She gave a small nod, her gaze returning to the twins. "Talking won't fix anything," she murmured. He followed her line of sight and replied softly, "Maybe not. But it's a start." They sat in silence for a long time. The boys were kicking a soccer ball now, their laughter carrying across the park. Michael watched them with an ache in his chest he didn't know how to describe. Every small movement they made, every laugh, every stumble, it all felt like pieces of him reflected back. "They're beautiful," he said finally. She didn't answer for a while, then spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "They're strong. I had to make sure they were." There was pride in her tone but also weariness. He turned toward her. "You did it all on your own," he said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded. "I had no choice." He wanted to tell her how sorry he was, but the words felt empty compared to the weight of what she had endured. Instead, he asked quietly, "What are their names?" She hesitated before answering. "Ethan and Caleb." The names hung in the air, and he repeated them silently to himself as if trying to etch them into his memory. Then one of the boys tripped over a small rock and fell to the ground. Before Emma could even move, Michael was already on his feet, crossing the few steps between them. The boy, Ethan, he thought, looked up at him with wide brown eyes full of surprise and confusion. "Hey, it's okay," Michael said softly, kneeling beside him and checking for scrapes. "You're brave, huh?" The child blinked at him, uncertain but comforted by the calm in his voice. Emma reached them a moment later, her breath quickened, and Michael stepped back immediately. "He's fine," Michael said. She gave him a quick, wary glance before kneeling to check for herself. When she saw the small scrape on Ethan's knee, she smiled and brushed his hair aside. "You'll live, soldier," she whispered, kissing his forehead. Michael stood silently, his chest tightening at the simple tenderness of it. After she patched the small cut with a bandage from her bag, she stood and faced him. For the first time, there wasn't anger in her eyes, just exhaustion. "You can't keep showing up like this, Michael," she said softly. "They don't know who you are, and I don't know how to explain it to them." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to. I just need you to know that I'm not walking away again." She studied him for a moment, searching his face for any trace of the man she used to know. "You said that once before," she said finally. "And then you did." He didn't argue. He knew he had no right to defend himself. "I know," he said quietly. "And that's why I'm here now." They didn't speak again after that. The boys called for her, and she turned away to join them, but before she left, she looked back once more. It was a small gesture, almost hesitant, but it was enough to keep him standing there long after she was gone. When he finally left the park, the evening sky had turned orange and gold, and for the first time in years, Michael felt something close to hope, a fragile, trembling kind of hope that made his chest hurt but kept him breathing. That night, he found himself thinking about everything she had said. He realized that if he wanted her to believe him, he had to prove it in actions, not words. The next day, he canceled 2 major meetings and called his lawyer, asking about legal ways to support her and the children without invading her life. He didn't want to buy forgiveness, he wanted to earn it. His lawyer was surprised. Michael Reed was known for being ruthless, not sentimental, but he didn't care. He had spent years hiding behind walls of pride and success. Now, for the first time, he wanted to build something real, even if it started from nothing. He didn't know if Emma would ever forgive him or if the boys would ever call him their father, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wouldn't stop trying. He had once laughed at the idea of giving up everything for love. Now, he finally understood that love wasn't about sacrifice, it was about showing up when it mattered most. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's life began to shift in ways that startled even him. The office that had once felt like the center of his universe no longer held the same power over him. Meetings blurred together, contracts lost their urgency, and he started spending more time outside of his steel and glass tower. He didn't tell anyone why, though his assistant noticed how distracted he had become. He was no longer chasing expansion or dominance, he was chasing something far more fragile: redemption. He visited the park whenever he knew Emma would be there, but this time, he didn't approach. He kept his distance, letting her and the boys live their moments without his intrusion. He simply watched, learning who they were through the smallest details, the way Caleb always tried to lead but Ethan had the gentler heart, how Emma laughed when they tackled her in the grass, how she looked at them like they were her entire world. He had never seen love so simple, so selfless, and every time he witnessed it, a piece of his old arrogance cracked away. One late afternoon, he noticed Emma struggling with a stroller full of groceries outside the cafe where she worked. Without thinking, he crossed the street and offered help. She looked startled at first, then wary. "Michael, you can't keep doing this," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "You can't keep showing up out of nowhere." He nodded but gently took the heavy bag from her hands anyway. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "I just want to help." She exhaled, torn between refusing and allowing him this small act. "Help with what, exactly?" she asked finally. "You weren't there when I needed you most. You don't get to pick and choose now." The words hurt, but he didn't react. "Then let me be here when you don't need me," he replied. "That's what I should have done in the first place." She looked at him for a long moment, confusion flickering behind her eyes. Something in his voice must have sounded different, less like the man she once knew and more like someone trying to understand what it meant to stay. She finally nodded, just once. "Fine," she said. "But that doesn't mean anything's changed." That evening, he carried her groceries up to her small apartment above the cafe. It was modest, warm, filled with soft light and the smell of vanilla from the candles on the counter. The boys were sitting at the table, drawing with colored pencils, their faces lighting up when they saw him. "Mom, that's the man from the park," Ethan said, his excitement innocent and unaware of the tension between the adults. Emma smiled faintly but didn't answer. Michael crouched down beside them, his heart pounding. "Hey, artists," he said gently. "What are you drawing?" Caleb held up a paper proudly. "Us. This is me, that's Ethan, and that's Mom." There were 3 stick figures holding hands, drawn in uneven lines but full of life. He noticed there was an empty space beside them. "And who's that for?" he asked, pointing at the blank space. Caleb shrugged. "No one yet," he said. "Maybe a dog." Michael smiled, but the lump in his throat was heavy. He didn't want to cry in front of them, but the innocence in their voices broke something deep inside him. Emma watched the scene quietly. For the first time, she saw a different man than the one who had left her 6 years ago. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like regret and sincerity. After dinner, which she reluctantly allowed him to stay for, the boys fell asleep on the couch, their heads leaning against each other. Michael stood beside her in silence, watching them breathe. "They're amazing," he said softly. She crossed her arms, still guarding herself. "They had to be," she replied. He turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did this all on your own." "I don't know how." Her expression softened, just slightly. "You learn," she said. "You don't have a choice." When he left that night, he stopped outside her door for a moment, wanting to say something more but not finding the courage. Instead, he looked back through the small window at the boys asleep on the couch. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man standing outside of their world, he felt like someone who might one day be allowed in. On the drive home, his chest ached with a strange combination of guilt and hope. He knew that earning her forgiveness would take time, maybe years, but for once, he wasn't afraid of the waiting. Over the next few weeks, he began to find small, quiet ways to help. He anonymously paid for the cafe's repairs after a storm damaged its roof, arranged new supplies for the boys' school without ever mentioning it, and never once used his name to take credit. Emma found out eventually, of course, she always did. She showed up at his office one evening, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to fix everything," she said when he tried to explain. "I'm not trying to fix it," he replied. "I'm trying to give back what I took." She didn't argue after that, but something in her eyes shifted, just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was no longer resistance. That night, when he came home, he stood by his window again, watching the city lights. For years, those lights had represented success to him, proof that he had conquered the world. Now, all he could think about was the warm glow of her kitchen, the soft laughter of two boys drawing pictures on the floor, and the quiet strength of the woman who had learned to live without him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the richest man in the city. He felt like a man finally beginning to understand what it meant to have something worth losing. Autumn came quietly that year, painting the town in gold and rust, and with it came a fragile kind of peace that neither of them fully understood. Michael had become a quiet presence in Emma's world, never demanding, never pushing too far, but always there in small, steady ways that began to soften the tension between them. He would show up at the cafe sometimes when business was slow, ordering coffee he never really drank just to sit at the corner table and watch her work. At first, she ignored him, pretending he wasn't there, but eventually, their glances began to linger. Sometimes he would help her close up, wiping tables or fixing the old shelves that always seemed to wobble. It was strange to her, seeing the same man who had once worn suits worth more than her yearly rent now carrying boxes and sweeping floors without complaint. He didn't seem to care about the stares of the regular customers or what anyone might think. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a kind of humility that disarmed her even when she tried to resist it. One evening, after closing, they walked together down the quiet street lined with flickering streetlights. The boys were asleep at home with a neighbor, and for the first time in years, they were alone without anger hanging between them. The air was cool, smelling faintly of rain, and their footsteps echoed softly on the pavement. Emma finally broke the silence. "Why are you really doing this, Michael?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with something wary. "You don't owe me anything anymore. You don't owe them either." He stopped walking and looked at her, the dim light catching in his brown eyes. "That's where you're wrong," he said quietly. "I owe you everything. You gave me something real, and I threw it away because I was too afraid to face what I felt. I thought success would fill that space. It didn't." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to see whether he truly meant it. "People don't just change," she said softly. He smiled, but there was no pride in it, only sadness. "No," he agreed. "But they can try to become better." The next morning, he showed up at the boys' school for their parent day. Emma hadn't asked him to come, but he appeared anyway, standing awkwardly among the other parents with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. When Ethan saw him through the classroom window, he waved excitedly, calling, "Mom, that man's here again." Emma felt a flicker of embarrassment, but also something else, something warmer that she couldn't quite name. During the activity, the children were asked to draw their families. Ethan and Caleb sat together, whispering and coloring with exaggerated seriousness. When they handed in their drawings, Emma's heart stopped for a moment. There were 4 figures now, not 3. 2 small ones, 1 woman, and 1 tall man with brown hair. "That's us," Caleb said proudly. "And that's him." He pointed at Michael, who stood watching from a few steps away, unaware of what they were saying. Emma felt her chest tighten. She looked at her sons, their faces glowing with innocence, and realized she couldn't protect them forever from the truth of who he was. Later that evening, when he walked her home, she handed him the boy's drawing without a word. He stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening. "They see me as part of it," he whispered. She nodded slowly. "They see kindness," she said quietly. "And they trust kindness." He looked up at her then, something breaking open in his expression. "I don't deserve that," he said. "Maybe not," she replied. "But they don't know what you've done. They only know who you are now." Her words lingered in the air between them like a fragile truth neither dared to touch. Over the following weeks, she began to allow him into their lives more fully. He picked the boys up from school when she worked late, helped with homework, even fixed the broken door in their apartment that had jammed for months. The boys grew attached to him quickly, their laughter filling the spaces that had once felt heavy and silent. Sometimes, late at night, Emma would hear them talking about him in their room, about how funny he was, how he told stories, how he never got angry when they spilled juice on his expensive shoes. Those small details made her heart ache in ways she couldn't explain. She wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the past, but the walls she had built were beginning to crumble. She saw the way he looked at the boys, the quiet awe in his eyes, and she knew it wasn't just guilt that brought him back, it was love. One night, after the boys had gone to bed, she found him sitting on the couch, staring at one of their drawings taped to the wall. She sat down across from him, her arms folded. "You know," she said softly, "for a long time, I wished you'd come back just so I could tell you to leave again." He gave a faint smile. "And now?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Now I'm not sure what I want." He looked at her for a long time before replying, his voice low and steady. "Then let me stay until you figure it out." She didn't respond, but she didn't tell him to leave either. The months that followed were slow and uncertain, filled with moments that felt fragile but real. Michael didn't push for more, he simply stayed, through the hard days, through the long nights, through the quiet mornings when the boys climbed into his lap to show him their drawings. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He was just there, learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. Emma watched him change piece by piece, and though she was still afraid, a small part of her began to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could change after all. Winter came earlier than usual that year, dusting the city in soft snow and quieting the streets that once felt endlessly alive. Emma had always loved this season, the stillness, the lights, the way everything seemed softer under a blanket of white, but this time it felt different. Her small apartment was warm, filled with the scent of cinnamon and laughter. Michael had become a fixture there, as natural as the sound of the boys' voices or the hum of the coffee machine she used every morning. What had once been awkward had slowly become familiar. He would arrive in the evenings, still in his work clothes, his hair mussed from the wind, and the boys would rush to him shouting his name. Emma would pretend not to watch, but every time they leapt into his arms, something in her chest tightened, a feeling she tried to push away but couldn't ignore anymore. He wasn't the same man who had left her 6 years ago, and she hated that part of her heart had started to remember why she had loved him in the first place. One night, after a long day of snow and laughter, they all sat together by the small Christmas tree the boys had helped decorate. The room glowed with soft golden light, and the twins were sprawled on the rug, building a castle out of blocks. Michael watched them with quiet fascination, his elbows resting on his knees, a faint smile curving his lips. Emma sat beside him on the couch, holding a cup of tea, pretending to read. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to think happiness looked like owning the world," he said. "Now I think it looks like this." She glanced up at him, unsure how to respond. There was no trace of arrogance in his words, only truth. He looked older now, calmer, the sharpness in his expression softened by something more human. "You were right," he continued, still watching the boys. You told me once that I'd lose myself chasing power. I thought you didn't understand. Turns out, I didn't understand anything. Emma lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the cup. People say things when they're angry, she said quietly. And you were a different person then. He turned to her slowly. No, he said, I was just a coward. I couldn't handle the idea that someone could love me for who I was, not what I built. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up and went to the window, watching the snow fall in the pale glow of the streetlights. The world outside was silent, almost unreal. After a long pause, she spoke softly. You hurt me, Michael. I don't think you ever understood how much. He stood too, his voice rough with guilt. I do now, he said. Every day. I see what I missed, what I destroyed, and I can't go back. I can only try to be here now, even if it's too late. Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment, she didn't turn around. The boys love you, she said finally. They talk about you all the time. He took a step closer, his voice shaking. And you? She turned then, meeting his eyes. I'm trying to forgive you, she said quietly. But it's hard to forget the man who walked away. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth without defense. I know, he said. I don't expect you to forget. I just hope you'll let me stay long enough to prove I won't walk away again. The days that followed were filled with a strange tenderness neither of them spoke about. Michael began joining them for dinners more often, reading bedtime stories to the boys, staying late enough that Emma sometimes found herself wishing he wouldn't leave at all. Yet she kept her guard up, knowing how dangerous hope could be. Then one evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, papers spread around him. What's wrong? She asked quietly. He looked up, exhausted. I'm selling the company, he said, almost in disbelief of his own words. I don't want it anymore. Not like this. She stared at him, startled. You've spent your whole life building it. He gave a small, tired laugh. And for what? To sit in an empty office and pretend it matters? I've spent years collecting things that meant nothing while ignoring the only thing that ever did. She didn't know what to say. There was a sincerity in his voice that terrified her, a finality she couldn't ignore. Michael, she whispered, you don't have to destroy everything to prove you've changed. He shook his head. I'm not destroying it. I'm freeing myself from it. I want to live for something real. That night, they sat together in silence, the snow falling outside in slow spirals. There were no grand gestures, no confessions, just two people sitting in the quiet after years of noise, realizing that maybe this was what healing looked like. She reached for the cup of tea he hadn't touched and set it closer to him. He smiled faintly, and for a brief moment, her hand brushed his. The contact was accidental, but it felt like a spark, like something that had been waiting for years to return. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them felt warm for the first time. In the days that followed, Emma noticed subtle changes in herself. The walls she had spent years building didn't feel as solid anymore. When Michael smiled, she didn't look away as quickly. When he stayed late, she didn't find reasons to make him leave. The boys began asking when he would move in, innocent to the complexity of adult hearts, and she found herself unable to give them an answer. One evening, as she tucked them into bed, Ethan asked, Mom, why do you look sad when you smile at him? She froze for a moment, then kissed his forehead. Because sometimes happiness takes time, she whispered. That night, when she returned to the living room, Michael was standing by the window again, looking out at the snow. He turned when he heard her footsteps. Do you ever think about how it could have been? He asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes. But if it hadn't happened the way it did, we wouldn't be here now. He smiled faintly, and there was something like relief in his eyes. Then maybe everything I broke was meant to lead me back to you. She looked at him for a long moment before finally whispering, "Don't make promises, Michael. Just stay." And this time, he didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, and in that silence, something between them finally began to heal. Spring arrived gently, almost hesitantly, as if the world was testing whether it was ready to be warm again. The snow melted into the soil, leaving behind traces of green that promised renewal, and with it came a sense of calm that Emma hadn't felt in years. The cafe was busier now, the boys had grown taller and bolder, and Michael had settled into their lives like a rhythm they hadn't realized they were missing. There was no announcement, no moment when he officially became part of their home. It just happened, quietly, as though the universe had always intended for him to find his way back. He began staying over more often, cooking breakfast with the boys on weekends, fixing the broken things in the apartment that Emma had learned to ignore, walking them to school before heading to meetings that now seemed secondary to everything else. The walls of her life that once felt too small for her dreams now felt like home again, filled with laughter and the sound of 3 voices calling her name. Michael had sold his company as he'd promised, a decision that shocked the world but didn't surprise Emma. He invested some of the money into the community, opening a small foundation to support single parents and children in need. For the first time, he felt proud of something not because it made him powerful, but because it made him human. He no longer measured success by what he owned but by who he was when he came home at night. Sometimes he still woke in the middle of the night, haunted by memories of who he'd been, the man who walked away, who laughed when love demanded something of him, but then he would hear the sound of quiet breathing beside him, see Emma's face resting peacefully against the pillow, and know he'd finally found his way back to the life he was meant to live. One warm afternoon, they all went to the park, the same one where he had first seen them after 6 years of silence. It looked different now, or maybe it was him who had changed. The trees were full again, the air smelled of flowers and sunlight, and laughter echoed through the open space. The boys raced ahead with a soccer ball, shouting for him to hurry, their voices full of that bright, reckless joy that only children could hold. Emma sat on a blanket under the same oak tree as before, her hair catching the light like threads of gold, her smile soft and calm. When he reached her, slightly out of breath, he sat down beside her and took a long look at the scene in front of him. For a moment, he said nothing, afraid that if he spoke, the fragile beauty of it all might disappear. Finally, he turned to her and said quietly, "I never thought I'd be the man sitting here." She looked at him, her eyes full of warmth. "That's because you weren't ready to be him," she said gently. "You had to lose everything to understand what it meant to have something worth keeping." They watched the boys play for a while in comfortable silence. The past no longer hung between them like a shadow, it was still there, but it had softened into something that no longer hurt. It was part of their story, something that shaped them but didn't define them anymore. Michael reached for her hand and intertwined his fingers with hers. She didn't pull away. The gesture was simple, quiet, and yet it carried more meaning than any words could. "You once asked me if I thought happiness was worth everything," he said after a while. "I used to think it wasn't. Now I know it's the only thing that matters." She smiled, her thumb brushing against his hand. "You finally stopped running," she said. He nodded. "Because I realized I was running from myself." As the sun began to dip lower, casting golden light across the field, the boys came running back, their cheeks flushed and hair messy. Ethan threw himself into his mother's lap, while Caleb plopped down beside Michael, handing him the soccer ball. "You were too slow," Caleb said with mock seriousness. Michael laughed, ruffling his hair. "I'm getting old," he said. "You'll have to carry me next time." The boys burst into laughter, and Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. The sound of their joy wrapped around them like music, a melody of second chances and new beginnings. When the park grew quieter and the light began to fade, they gathered their things and started home. Michael walked beside Emma, his arm brushing against hers, the boys running ahead and turning back every few steps to make sure they were still following. The air was cool and sweet, and everything felt impossibly alive. He looked at her and said softly, "Do you ever think about the day we met again in this park?" She nodded, her smile wistful. "I think about it often. It felt like fate was giving you one last chance." He laughed quietly. "Then I'm glad I finally listened." Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, they stood on the balcony watching the stars. The city lights shimmered below, the world quiet around them. Emma turned to him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you regret anything?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said. "Because every mistake led me here." She smiled faintly. "You sound like a man who's finally made peace with himself." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression soft. "I think I have. Because peace isn't something you find, it's something you build." When she reached for his hand again, he held it without hesitation, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt the weight of what had been lost. They only felt the warmth of what had been found. The man who had once laughed at the idea of love now knew it was the only thing that could save him, and the woman who had once sworn to never let him back in finally realized that forgiveness was its own kind of freedom. Together, they stood in the quiet night, surrounded by the sounds of their children's soft breathing, the city beyond, and the steady heartbeat of something rare and unbreakable, hope reborn, love returned, and a life finally whole again.